Hi, my name is Steve Dopoulos. I'm a student here at the college as well as I'm a music educator at a high school. Today I'm going to be talking to all of you about the No Child Left Behind Act. If you don't know what this is, George Bush has two major legacies. One of them would be the war that started in Iraq that's still going on until today. And the second would be a thing that most of you may have noticed, may have done as state standardized testing. This was one part of the No Child Left Behind Act that was implemented in 2001 as a part of changing education reform. Now, there's a problem with this because No Child Left Behind hasn't fulfilled all the promises it originally stated. Now, according to Congress lawmakers in 2001, the purpose of No Child Left Behind was to give students a smaller achievement gap in between the students that are getting high grades as well as low grades. So they wanted to minimize that gap, as well as they wanted to give parents more options between what schools their students go to. If you're living in a low-income area, and if the school isn't good, then you should be able to have the chance to move your student to another school that's doing better. On top of this, the way that Congress was planning on implementing this was putting responsibility in the hands of schools instead. So if your school is doing negatively, then you have to improve yourself. And from a positive point, this act did do well in the sense that it did follow through with giving parents the options of allowing their students to get out of negative schools that were having low graduation rates, some as low as only 30% of their students according to the 2012 educational boards, as well as others that were having an 18% drop at certain points. Those are in extremely low income areas. On an overall, though, there does have to be a reform to this. The negative part being that, unfortunately, giving the schools responsibility comes down to the teachers. And the problem is that to have accountability, they tried using a test that went overall that was only a multiple choice test that doesn't really account and show everything that one individual student is. One multiple choice test doesn't tell you everything you need to know about an individual person or whether or not they're actually learned the subject. Some people are inherently bad at testing. So how could they enforce this though? How could they make teachers teach these tests better? Unfortunately, this came down to money. How they decided to do this was if your students were doing badly, they would actually reduce the funding that your school was getting. But the positive was that if your students were doing good, then they would give you extra funding and then they would give you more money to have more supplies available for your students, to have more staff on hand to help out. One of the things that was an issue though is that this became less about the students and more about a funding issue overall. And the problem was that this was started in 2001 and we are now currently in 2014. The economy has changed drastically in the United States, especially from the 2007 housing bubble as well as the market crash which happened with the banks. So the problem is that this is no longer a student issue, but a funding issue. So secondly, testing became important for the benefit of the schools and not the students. And to improve this, what they had to do is they had to give low-income students help that they needed. But with the current standing of how it is, if you're coming from low-income background, and if you don't have money at home, and if your school isn't getting any funding, how are you supposed to improve those schools? So in the schools, what happened is that if they had a negative standing, which was if your school wasn't having a higher graduation rate than 40%, then you were considered needing improvement. If you needed improvement, you had 2 years to improve your graduation rates. Otherwise, your school could be shut down, which did happen all across the bottom area of the South, which was Louisiana, some parts of Florida, and some lower areas of California as well as Nevada. And the problem was that the schools that were already doing well, that already had high achieving students, already had high grades, high grading students, already had graduation rates of more than 75 or 80%, they were getting funding that they didn't need. If you're doing well, if your students are passing, then you would get the funding. That was their incentive. But you don't need the funding if you're already doing well. And the students that need it can't get the funding because they weren't doing well. So this is one horrible cycle of schools are now shutting down and schools that don't need funding are getting it. As of 2012, the overall graduation rate from the United States fluctuated from 40% to 70% based on different areas. according to the 2012 Board of Education. And the problem was that not only was this incentive not being given out to students that needed it, the schools that they did say that they were going to give the incentive to weren't even receiving the funding because of educational cutbacks from the housing market crash, as well as funding going to other areas, mostly the military, unfortunately. However, the positive thing is, though, that there is a recognizing from Congress that there needs to be a change to this bill. It's a 13-year-old bill now, and now you're having students that grew up in an area where for 13 years they were being taught not how to think creatively, not how to think outside of the box, but instead how to take a test. 13 years worth of students, that is thousands upon thousands of students that weren't learning creatively, but multiple choice test taking. The positive thing is, Obama did ask for a revision of the bill as of 2012 to 2013 from the New York Times. They stated that. However, the problem was that as of the end of 2013, that bill was not yet given to Obama revised. So there's a need for change, there's a recognition for this change, but no one's taking action. Thank you.
All right, I think the personal greeting is designed to give you a little bit of credibility with the audience because you do work in the schools, and so that makes sense. You've got a clear identification of what the proposition is. That's pretty solid. The layout of the contents, though, is not as clear. I think that you kind of give us a preview of what the general ideas are without necessarily telling us what the structure is going to be. And those ideas are very broad at the beginning of the speech, so I'm not sure that it's going to help us keep track of the development of the argument in the body of the presentation. When you get to the beginning of the speech, I think that you have a problem, like I said, because I'm not sure that the supporting claims are very distinct. I did hear explanations of several ideas that I thought make sense, and you did a pretty good job kind of summarizing some of the things that are going on in the No Child Left Behind law. Some of the complications, like the inconsistency of taking money away from schools that are failing, but of course you do want to describe what the sequencing is. I think that that's the argument that was going in the other direction, is why are we continuing to fund failing schools instead of funding schools that are doing well, and so how do we get the kids? And you said at one point, it has succeeded in getting kids out of the schools and giving them choices. And I'm going, okay, so where's the example of that? Where's the information that says that kids have been able to get out of those schools? And by the way, later on, you make a claim that says there were a whole bunch of schools that were closed down, for instance. I'm assuming that those were the bad schools that maybe those kids got out of. Did they get into better schools? Did they have a better opportunity as a consequence? That's some of the information that needs to fit together a little bit more effectively, so I can see that some things are working and some things are not working there. The way the law is supposed to work, I think you explained it pretty well. The data, I think, is inconsistent. Like I said, you've got some information about test scores and about graduation rates, and you give us some source citations on that. You made a reference to schools that got closed or taken over, and you said mostly in the South, but I didn't hear any source citation on that information, and I didn't hear any how many schools that was. that could be 3 schools, and one in Louisiana, one in Florida, and one in Mississippi, or it could be hundreds of schools. I have no idea how to evaluate whether or not this is something that is brutalizing the schools, or if it is something that is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, getting rid of the crappy schools. So that's the argument that you want to be making, is that the allocation of the money, instead of it going to schools that need improvement, it's not going to those schools. I think you get sidetracked in a couple of arguments concerning, for instance, the economy. There may be a reason why the schools are not providing as much money as they once did, but you would have to develop that argument. And if that is related to No Child Left Behind, you'd have to show that there's a relationship. My understanding, and I'm not an expert on the subject, my understanding, of course, is that No Child Left Behind is just funded through federal money, and so it's the federal money that comes down. It doesn't have any relationship with the state money that's going on there. So the Fed's got $60 billion that they're going to give out to schools, and they'll give it to schools to fund these kinds of programs. But if the programs don't start working, then they're going to say, well, we're going to reward schools that are doing a good job and not reward schools that are doing a bad job. But that $60 billion gets spread amongst the 50 states, and that's not where most of the school money comes from. So I could be wrong on that. I'm not saying that I am. I'm just saying that's my impression of what goes on there. So how the economy affected that, you would have to say, for instance, well, the economy, they cut the amount of money. They started off with No Child Left Behind having $50 billion back in 2002 or 2003, and now they've only got $25 billion that they're spending on it. Then I can see, okay, there's been a cut and there's some problem that's going on there. But I don't get any of that data. Look, we don't want to listen to somebody go through the tax tables or the budget requests for every school in the country, but you're making an argument that says that the money's not going to places that it needs to go. Well, let's see some examples of that, as opposed to kind of this general idea that it can't be going to the schools that it's supposed to, because they're the ones who are being punished. I think there's a presupposition there that needs to be demonstrated before you can go along with that. Presentation-wise, you do an excellent job talking to the audience. You speak very reasonably. You explain concepts. I do think that there are a couple of things that you might want to be careful of. For example, I don't know that the Bush slam gets you much at the beginning of the speech. I'm sure plenty of people will be hyped up about that because they don't care much for Bush. But anybody who is indifferent or feels good about what was going on, they're going to say, well, what is that for? Talk about the issue, don't talk about the politics stuff. And you always want to be careful about those kinds of things. It amazes me that anybody who has a product to sell does something that knocks potential customers. You always want to have as many customers as possible. So make your argument for everybody, not just for people who already are disinclined to see one thing. All right. The other thing is that at the end you make this argument about the revisions that are being proposed, and I want to know, what are those revisions? What is it that's going to fix this? I'm sure that there are some things that, look, it's screwy. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and I would never want that job ever. And any of you who are thinking about becoming elementary school teachers, rethink it, because that is the most ridiculous. Yeah, I don't care. You can go on YouTube. I've said it before. I sound hypocritical saying don't become a teacher, when that's kind of what I do. But I don't have to do this stuff that she does yet. 5 years from now, it may be different.